Hey guys. Tonight we drift at the edge of daylight, standing barefoot on a narrow canoe as the sun lowers itself into the Pacific like it's clocking out early. You feel the wood beneath you, smooth from hands and salt and generations of repair, and the water breathing gently against the hull. The horizon is wide and patient. Around you, elders sit cross-legged, unbothered by distance, unhurried by time, speaking of islands that are nowhere in sight but somehow already present. They talk the way people do when they know something deeply enough to be casual about it. You listen, and you realize they aren't pointing at places so much as remembering them into existence. You probably won't survive this. By the way, at least not the part where there's no map. No compass. No glowing blue dot telling you you've missed your turn by 3,000 miles. Still, you're here, so you might as well relax into it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I love imagining all of us drifting off together across different time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The elders begin as the first stars arrive. Not all at once, but politely, one by one. Dusk is their favorite hour. This is when memory wakes up. One voice starts a story, another finishes it, a third adds a detail that feels like seasoning rather than correction. They speak of islands as if they were relatives, temperamental, reliable, sometimes shy. An island might be the one that waits beyond the long swell, or the place where birds argue at dawn. These aren't metaphors for poetry's sake. They are filing systems for the mind. You notice that no one is writing anything down. That's your first mainstream historical fact for the evening. Polynesian navigation traditions were primarily oral, passed through generations without written maps. Knowledge lived in chants, stories, genealogies, and rituals. The canoe itself was a floating archive, carrying not just people but accumulated memory. When a navigator spoke, they weren't improvising, they were retrieving. As the light thins, one elder gestures upward, not dramatically, no grand finger pointing like a planetarium guide, but with a subtle tilt of the chin. A star has appeared low on the horizon. Its name is spoken softly, followed by another, and another, forming a sequence. These stars rise and set in predictable patterns, and navigators memorize them as pathways across the sky. Each path corresponds to a direction over the sea. Think of it as a celestial subway map, except there are no delays and the stations are on fire. That's joke number 1. You're welcome. The quirky tidbit slips in almost unnoticed. Some star paths were remembered through songs whose rhythms matched the pacing of paddling. If you keep the beat, you keep the direction. Miss a verse, and congratulations, you're now spiritually off course. It's a reminder that memory here isn't static storage, it's movement. Breath, timing. You feel the canoe rock gently, and someone laughs, a low, relaxed sound. The mood is calm, but not sleepy yet. This is alert calm, the kind that comes from familiarity. The elders recall a long voyage, naming each island in sequence, not as dots on a line but as moments in a story. Island A is where the wind shifts. Island B is where the water smells different. Island C is where the stars feel closer. You try to picture this, and your brain, trained on GPS coordinates and battery percentages, quietly panics. That's joke number 2. Historians still argue whether early Polynesian navigators could intentionally sail both to and from distant islands or whether some voyages were one-way journeys of extraordinary luck. As you stand here, listening, the debate feels oddly distant. The elders don't talk about luck. They talk about preparation, attention, and memory sharpened through repetition. Luck might exist, but it doesn't get invited into the planning meetings. Another elder mentions the horizon itself, describing it not as a line but as a living edge that changes shape. This is where things get wonderfully strange. Navigators were taught to notice how the sky dome seems to dip closer to the water in certain directions. A subtle cue that land might be present beyond sight. Modern science calls some of these effects atmospheric refraction. Traditional knowledge calls it paying attention. Both agree it works often enough to matter. The sun is gone now, and the canoe exists in that soft blue space before full night. Someone tells a story about an apprentice who tried to secretly bring a carved stick along on his first voyage. Just in case, when the elders found it, they laughed and tossed it overboard, not as punishment, but as instruction. Trust your memory, they told him. Also, stop trying to invent waterproof paper. That's joke number 3, and yes, it landed better in the original telling. You realize that remembering islands without maps isn't about holding an image of a coastline in your head. It's about remembering relationships between stars, swells, winds, birds, and time. Memory here is ecological. Lose one element, and the rest help you recover it. It's redundancy built into culture. As the elders' voices soften, the stars multiply. You feel smaller, but not insignificant. The canoe keeps moving. Not urgently, just steadily, like it knows where it's going even if you don't. And maybe that's the point. You don't need to see the island yet. For now, it's enough to know that someone remembers it. And that memory, shared and repeated, is already guiding you there. The canoe keeps sliding forward. And you begin to notice how casually everyone treats the absence of anything resembling a map. No rolled parchment, no scratched wood diagram. No helpful arrow saying you are here, which would be deeply reassuring right now. Instead, what surrounds you is memory, layered, spoken, and oddly precise. The elders talk as if the ocean itself is a familiar neighborhood. And you're the only one who just moved in and still doesn't know where the light switches are. You listen closely as one voice explains that maps, as you understand them, would actually be a problem out here. A flat drawing can't move. The ocean does. Winds shift, currents wander, stars rotate. So instead of fixing knowledge to paper, Polynesian navigators fixed it to stories that could flex and adapt. That's your mainstream historical fact for this stretch. Traditional Polynesian navigation relied on dynamic mental models rather than static cartography. Routes weren't lines, they were living sequences. You're told that young navigators memorized star compasses. Mental frameworks dividing the horizon into named houses where stars rise and set. Each house corresponds to a direction. The compass isn't drawn, it's imagined, rehearsed, and refreshed every night. You think about how often you forget your own phone number, and quietly keep that to yourself. Joke number 1. As the canoe rocks, an elder begins reciting a chant. It sounds musical but purposeful, like a lullaby with a job. Each verse references a star, a swell, or a wind, and together they encode an entire voyage. This is where memory becomes infrastructure. Forget a verse, and you haven't just missed a lyric, you've misplaced an island. No pressure. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some chants were intentionally boring. Long, repetitive, almost monotonous, not because creativity was lacking, but because boredom helps memory stick. When your mind settles, patterns embed more deeply. Congratulations, you're participating in a centuries-old cognitive science experiment without signing a consent form. Joke number 2. You notice that stories are rarely told exactly the same way twice. Details shift slightly depending on who's listening, where the canoe is, and what the sea is doing. This isn't corruption of data, it's calibration. The elders adjust emphasis the way a sailor trims a sail. Historians still argue whether this flexibility made navigation more resilient or introduced unacceptable ambiguity. Sitting here, with the canoe moving smoothly, the argument feels academic. Someone mentions an island not by its name, but by the journey to it. 3 nights after the Red Star, they say, distance is remembered as time and experience, not miles. This explains why European explorers, armed with maps and instruments, often underestimated Polynesian voyages. They were measuring space. Polynesians were measuring relationships. You try to imagine memorizing hundreds of islands this way. Your brain immediately asks for folders, labels, maybe a spreadsheet. The elders use genealogy instead. Islands are linked to ancestors, migrations, and events. Remember the family story, and you remember the route. Forget your great uncle's name. And suddenly you're drifting somewhere near open panic. Joke number 3. As the stars climb higher, the conversation slows. You realize that memory here isn't about hoarding information. It's about constant use. Knowledge that isn't spoken fades. So it's spoken often, gently, rhythmically, especially at dusk when attention is soft but awake. You feel that softness now, like the sea is smoothing out the sharp edges of thought. The canoe keeps going. No map appears. No one seems worried. And slowly, neither are you. The absence of paper begins to feel less like a risk and more like an invitation to listen, to notice, to remember in ways you forgot were possible. The canoe creaks softly as weight shifts. And without any announcement, the lesson continues. There's no bell ringing, no chalkboard scraping. The canoe itself is the classroom. And you're already enrolled whether you filled out the paperwork or not. The elders don't face you in a row. They sit scattered, relaxed, correcting each other gently, the way people do when the goal is accuracy, not winning. You're told that learning navigation never began on the open ocean. It started on land, often years earlier, long before anyone trusted you with saltwater and responsibility. Children listened to stories at night, tracing imagined journeys in their minds while lying on woven mats. Routes were spoken the way bedtime stories are spoken, slow, repetitive, comforting. By the time someone stepped into a canoe as a trainee navigator, they weren't learning new information. They were activating memories that had been quietly forming for years. That's the mainstream historical fact sliding in unnoticed. Polynesian navigational education was lifelong and immersive. Beginning in childhood through oral repetition rather than formal instruction. You didn't cram for a test. You absorbed until it felt obvious. Out here, though, the canoe sharpens everything. One elder asks a question, casually, as if making conversation. Which star will guide us after midnight? There's a pause, not awkward, just expectant. Someone answers. Someone else adds a correction. No one is scolded. Mistakes aren't failures, they're part of calibration. You feel oddly grateful this isn't a pop quiz with grades posted later. The quirky tidbit arrives wrapped in humor. Some training voyages intentionally avoided the most direct route. Elders would steer slightly off course just to see who noticed. If you didn't, congratulations, you'd just earned a very quiet, very memorable lesson in humility. Joke number 1. Because nothing says education like gentle psychological warfare at sea. You begin to understand that memory here is social. Knowledge isn't locked inside one brilliant mind. It's distributed across people. One navigator remembers stars. Another remembers swells. Another remembers bird behavior. Together, they form a complete system. Alone, any one of them would struggle. This makes losing a single elder tragic, but not catastrophic. The system survives through redundancy. Historians still argue whether this distributed model made Polynesian navigation more resilient than European systems dependent on individual experts and instruments. Sitting in the canoe, with voices overlapping calmly, resilience feels less like a theory and more like a lived experience. The elders tell a story about a legendary navigator who could feel direction through the canoe. Modern researchers suggest this may relate to subtle changes in wave interference patterns transmitted through the hull. Traditional explanations are simpler. You listen with your whole body. Either way, you shift your weight slightly and pretend you feel something profound. You don't. Joke number 2. As night deepens, the canoe classroom grows quieter. Not because learning has stopped, but because it's moving inward. You're encouraged to watch rather than ask. Notice how the canoe angles into the swell. Notice how the stars drift relative to the bow. Notice how no one rushes to fill silence. Silence is part of the curriculum. You realize that written maps externalize memory. They let you forget, because the paper remembers for you. Here, forgetting isn't outsourced. It's confronted gently, corrected collectively, and smoothed over with repetition. That makes memory heavier, but also warmer. Someone mentions that the canoe itself carries memory through design. The shape responds to waves in predictable ways. The sound of water against the hull changes with direction. Experienced navigators could tell orientation by listening, especially at night when vision softened. You strain your ears. It mostly sounds like water being water. Joke number 3. Still, something shifts. You stop trying to hold everything at once. You let the voices wash over you. Patterns begin to form without effort. The canoe glides on, and learning becomes less about storing facts and more about trusting that, given time and attention, memory will arrange itself. The classroom keeps moving, so do you. The night has fully arrived now, and the stars are no longer shy. They spread across the sky with quiet confidence, filling every dark gap you didn't realize you'd been staring into. The elders lift their gazes not all at once, but in staggered glances, like people checking in on old friends across a crowded room. No one gasps, no one points dramatically. These stars have been showing up on time for a very long while. You're told, almost offhandedly, that each of these stars has a personality. Not in the horoscope sense. Thankfully, more like reliable neighbors. Some rise quickly, some take their time, some are bright but brief, others are faint yet stubbornly consistent. Navigators memorize not just where stars appear, but how they behave over the night. That's the mainstream historical fact settling in. Polynesian navigators used rising and setting stars as directional guides, following known star paths across the ocean. An elder murmurs the name of a star as it clears the horizon, and another responds with the name of the island associated with that path. It's less like calling out coordinates and more like greeting an old bus route. You imagine a celestial transit map, but instead of colors and numbers, it's built from memory and repetition. Also, no one complains about delays. Joke number 1. You're encouraged to watch how stars don't just rise straight up. They angle, they drift, they arc. Navigators learned these movements so well that even when clouds obscured part of the sky, the remaining stars were enough to reconstruct direction. It's a skill built on familiarity, not calculation. You think about how lost you feel when your phone drops from 5G to nothing. The comparison does not flatter you. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some navigators practice by lying on their backs on land, naming stars aloud in sequence as they crossed the sky. Hour after hour, it was both training and entertainment, which suggests ancient Polynesian stargazing parties were either deeply soothing or extremely nerdy. Possibly both. Joke number 2. The elders speak about star houses, invisible segments along the horizon where specific stars rise and set. Each house marks a direction. The canoe's bow aligns with the house, and as long as the chosen star stays in that house, you're on course. When it drifts, you adjust. Simple in theory. In practice, you'd absolutely panic the first time a cloud rolled in. Thankfully, clouds have patterns too. Historians still argue whether navigators relied more heavily on individual stars or on the overall rotation of the night sky as a dome. Some suggest it was a combination. Stars provided precision, while the sky's motion offered reassurance. Out here, the debate feels less important than the result. The canoe keeps moving steadily, without hesitation. An elder tells a story about a novice who fixated too much on one star, ignoring the others. When that star disappeared behind clouds, the novice froze. The lesson wasn't, pick better stars, but, never trust only one memory. Redundancy. Again, memory with backups. You begin to notice how calm everyone is about uncertainty. Stars can vanish, clouds can thicken. The ocean doesn't care about your plans. Instead of fighting this, navigators expect it. They prepare memory not as a rigid script, but as a flexible web. Lose one strand, and the rest still hold. Someone jokes that the stars are easier to trust than people because they don't exaggerate their achievements. Joke number 3. Delivered so dryly it almost slips past you. As the canoe glides on, the stars feel closer, not physically, but relationally. You stop seeing them as distant objects and start seeing them as markers in a shared story. You realize that memory here isn't just internal, it's anchored in the sky itself. Forgetting would require the stars to forget too. Your eyes grow heavy, but not tired, more like settled. The stars keep moving, and the canoe follows, gently, confidently. You don't know which island lies ahead. You just know that, according to memory older than writing, You're heading the right way. And for now, that's enough. The canoe leans gently, almost imperceptibly, and you feel it more through your knees than your eyes. No one comments on it out loud, but a few elders subtly adjust their posture, as if responding to a shared cue you haven't learned yet. This is where the lesson shifts away from the sky and drops directly beneath your feet. The stars may point the way, but the ocean itself is doing most of the talking now. You're told to stop looking so hard. Instead, you're asked to feel. The swells move through the canoe in long, steady rhythms, arriving from different directions depending on distant winds and storms you will never see. Navigators memorize these rhythms the way musicians memorize time signatures. One swell might come from the east, another from the south, overlapping without cancelling each other out. Together, they form a moving grid. That's the mainstream historical fact easing in. Polynesian navigators used ocean swell patterns as directional guides, recognizing consistent wave trains that persisted across vast distances. You shift your weight and try to identify something, anything, distinct. Mostly, it feels like water doing water things. The elders assure you that's normal. It takes years to tell the difference between a primary swell and background chop. Your resume of, once went to the beach, does not qualify you yet. Joke number 1. An elder explains that even at night, when stars hide behind clouds, the swells don't lie. They keep their direction long after the wind that created them has moved on. This means the ocean remembers weather events thousands of miles away. You find this both comforting and mildly unsettling, like realizing your couch remembers every snack you've ever spilled on it. Here comes the quirky tidbit. Some navigators described swells as having voices. Not literally speaking, no whispered coordinates, but distinct personalities you could learn to recognize. One swell feels slow and confident. Another feels hurried and shallow. Modern oceanographers would talk about wavelength and period. Traditional knowledge just calls it listening carefully. Historians still argue whether swell navigation alone could guide a canoe accurately across the open ocean, or whether it only worked in combination with stars and other cues. The elders don't seem interested in choosing sides. For them, it's never one thing. It's always many small confirmations stacking quietly until direction feels obvious. You notice how relaxed everyone remains, even as the canoe rises and falls. No one braces dramatically. No one clutches anything. The body adapts, learns, remembers. Navigation here isn't just mental, it's embodied. Your muscles are part of the memory system, even if they haven't read the syllabus yet. Someone tells a story about a young navigator who panicked during a storm because the swells felt wrong. Afterward, the elders explained that the swells weren't wrong, the navigator was. Specifically, he was tense. Tension distorts perception. The ocean hadn't changed. His listening had. Joke number 2 lands softly, because it's uncomfortably relatable. You try to relax your shoulders. The canoe responds with a gentle emotion. Or maybe that's just coincidence. Either way, you feel calmer, like the ocean rewards effort with cooperation, even if it doesn't strictly owe you anything. As minutes stretch into something softer than time, you begin to sense patterns without naming them. A longer rise, a slower fall, a subtle sideways push that repeats. You don't analyze it, you let it happen. This, you realize, is how memory deepens, when effort steps aside. The canoe continues on, carried by swells that have crossed oceans before you ever arrived. They don't rush, neither do you. The air changes before anyone says a word. It's subtle, so subtle you almost miss it. But one of the elders lifts their head slightly, like someone catching a familiar tune drifting in from another room. The canoe keeps moving, the swells steady beneath you, but now attention rises from the water into the space above it. This part of the lesson doesn't ask you to look far, it asks you to notice small things. Birds appear first, dark shapes crossing the starlit sky with purposeful wing beats. Not flocks, not chaos. Individual travelers on quiet errands. An elder murmurs their names, distinguishing which birds sleep on land and which never do. That distinction matters more than you'd expect. This is your mainstream historical fact for the section. Polynesian navigators observed bird behavior to detect the proximity and direction of land, especially species that forage at sea by day and return to shore at night. You watch a bird pass overhead and feel an unreasonable surge of hope, like spotting a gas station sign on an empty highway. Someone chuckles softly at your enthusiasm. Easy, they seem to say. Birds lie sometimes. Joke number 1. Still, patterns emerge. Certain birds fly out at dawn and return at dusk, rarely straying beyond known distances. If you see them late, you're probably closer to land than you think. If you see none at all, you're either far out, or just unlucky. The elders don't panic either way. They just file the observation away. One more thread in the web of memory. Clouds come next. Not the dramatic, stormy kind you'd expect to matter, but small, stubborn formations hovering near the horizon. An elder points, not sharply, just enough for you to follow their gaze. That one stays. They say, clouds can anchor themselves above islands, fed by rising moisture from land. The cloud doesn't mark the island exactly, but it hints, like a shy messenger refusing to give full directions. Here's the quirky tidbit. Navigators sometimes recognized specific islands by the shape of their clouds, passed down through description and story. The cloud that leans, the cloud that splits, the cloud that never quite decides. You wonder how many cloud shapes you'd confuse under pressure. All of them, probably. Joke number 2. Historians still argue how reliable cloud reading truly was, given how changeable weather can be. Some suggest it was most useful within certain distances, while others believe experienced navigators could read far subtler cues than modern observers realize. Out here, clouds don't promise certainty, they offer suggestions, and suggestions are enough. Then there's smell. This surprises you. An elder inhales deeply, not theatrically, just attentively. You follow suit and catch something faint, earthy, green, almost imagined. Vegetation, maybe. Or maybe your brain is filling in blanks because it wants land to exist. The elders don't rush to confirm. Smell is tricky. It drifts. It fades. It lies more politely than birds. But smell joins the pattern. Combined with birds, clouds, swells, and stars, it strengthens a hypothesis. Navigation here isn't about one perfect signal. It's about accumulating small, imperfect ones until doubt quiets down. Someone tells a story about a voyage where every sign pointed to land except smell. They trusted the signs anyway. Land appeared by morning. Another story follows where smell promised land but nothing else agreed. They sailed on. No land appeared. The lesson isn't mystical. It's statistical. Trust clusters, not outliers. You realize how exhausting this would be if you were anxious. Constant noticing. Constant adjustment. No checklist to complete. But the elders aren't tense. They've trained attention to be gentle, not frantic. Observation happens without gripping. Joke number 3 slides in when someone mentions that seabirds have better navigation skills than most humans, which feels unnecessary but fair. As the canoe moves forward, you stop scanning desperately and start letting signs come to you. A bird crosses, a cloud lingers, the air shifts again, just slightly. Nothing dramatic happens, and that's the point. Memory isn't triggered by spectacle. It's triggered by familiarity. You feel your thoughts slow, stretching like warm fabric. The ocean keeps breathing. The sky stays open. Somewhere ahead, land may or may not be waiting. For now, the signs are enough, and your mind settles into the quiet work of noticing without urgency. The canoe glides on. The night feels deeper now. Not darker exactly, but thicker, like the sky has settled closer to the water. The stars are still there, steady and patient, but you sense a shift in how people are watching them. Less naming, more comparing. This is the part where certainty loosens its grip, and conversation becomes careful. You're entering the territory where even the elders disagree. And somehow, that's treated as a feature, not a flaw. Someone mentions how 2 navigators once argued over a star's exact rising point. The disagreement wasn't loud or sharp. It unfolded slowly, like a tight conversation, each offering a memory, a past voyage, a slightly different experience. This is where you realize something important. Polynesian navigation wasn't a single, fixed system. It was many related traditions, adapted across islands, generations, and personalities. That's your mainstream historical fact here. Wayfinding knowledge varied between regions and lineages, evolving over time rather than remaining uniform. You feel a strange relief hearing this. Even here, on a canoe guided by memory older than most civilizations, people debate. Knowledge breathes. It argues quietly with itself. Historians still argue whether Polynesian star navigation was mathematically precise or more interpretive, relying on broad directional zones rather than exact bearings. Some scholars emphasize astonishing accuracy. Others point to flexibility and correction over time. Sitting here, the debate feels almost cozy, like listening to family members disagree over the best route home while still arriving safely every year. An elder gestures at the sky dome, explaining that some navigators focused less on individual stars and more on how the whole sky rotated through the night. If the sky's movement stayed balanced around the canoe, direction was steady. If it drifted unevenly, something was off. You try to imagine tracking the rotation of the heavens while standing on a moving canoe. Your brain politely refuses. Joke number 1. The quirky tidbit comes wrapped in a smile. Some navigators deliberately learned multiple, slightly conflicting systems so they wouldn't become rigid. If one method failed, clouds, fatigue, doubt, another could take over. It's redundancy again, but this time built from disagreement. That's surprisingly modern for something ancient. You notice that no one rushes to resolve differences. The elders let uncertainty sit. They trust that time, repetition, and additional signs will clarify things. You think about how quickly modern conversations escalate when someone says, "I'm not sure," out here. "I'm not sure" is just part of the process. Someone jokes, very softly, that stars don't mind being misunderstood, because they'll still be there tomorrow night. Joke number 2 floats by, barely disturbing the calm. The canoe continues forward, guided not by perfect agreement, but by overlapping confidence. Even if two people interpret a star's role differently, the result often converges. Minor errors are corrected gently by swells, winds, and time. Navigation here tolerates fuzziness. It plans for it. You feel your own need for certainty soften. You stop trying to lock the experience into clear rules. Instead, you let impressions layer themselves: stars, motion, voices, silence. The lack of a single, final answer doesn't bother you anymore. It feels restful. The elders' voices lower. Debate fades into memory sharing again. The sky keeps rotating, unconcerned. The ocean keeps its rhythm. Somewhere in the dark, direction holds, not because everyone agrees perfectly, but because enough of them agree enough. You stand quietly, balanced between opinions, stars, and swells, and realize that uncertainty, when handled gently, doesn't disturb sleep at all. The canoe shifts course slightly, and this time the adjustment is intentional. No one announces it. You only notice because the stars slide just a bit differently across the bow, like furniture rearranged in a dark room. An elder smiles, not reassuringly, but knowingly. This is the part of learning that feels uncomfortable on purpose. You're told, quietly, that sometimes navigators were trained by being lost, not abandoned, not endangered, but gently misaligned. Elders would alter the course without explanation, letting apprentices sit with uncertainty long enough for their senses to wake up. That's your mainstream historical fact for this section. Deliberate disorientation was sometimes used as a teaching method in Polynesian wayfinding, forcing learners to rely on observation rather than instruction. Your modern instincts flare immediately. This feels inefficient, risky, possibly a lawsuit waiting to happen. Joke number 1. But the elders explain that certainty can become a crutch. When you know exactly where you are, you stop noticing how you know it. Getting lost, just enough, reactivates memory. Suddenly, every swell matters. Every star earns attention. You don't panic, you sharpen. Here comes the quirky tidbit. Some apprentices later said their most important lessons came from voyages where they felt briefly deeply unsure, not frightened, just unanchored. The elders called this opening the ears. It sounds poetic. It also sounds like a polite way of saying, "We messed with you on purpose." Historians still argue whether such training methods were widespread or reserved for advanced learners, since deliberately obscuring direction could be dangerous. Out here, though, danger is managed by experience. Elders never truly let go. They just loosen the grip enough for growth to happen. You feel the tension in your body ease as you accept not knowing. Once you stop trying to force orientation, clues surface more clearly. The swell pattern feels slightly different now, still familiar, but offset. A star you hadn't noticed earlier becomes suddenly important. Memory steps forward when anxiety steps back. Someone tells a story about an apprentice who tried to secretly mark stars with charcoal on his arm during training. The marks smeared with sweat within an hour. The elders said nothing. Lesson learned. Joke number 2. The canoe glides on, slightly off from where you thought it was going, but still moving with confidence. You realize that being lost here doesn't mean being without direction. It means direction hasn't revealed itself yet. Your breathing slows. The night feels less demanding. Uncertainty no longer presses, it floats. You stand there, balanced between knowing and not knowing, and understand why this lesson couldn't be taught any other way. The canoe keeps drifting, gently wrong, patiently right. The canoe steadies again, and with that subtle return to confidence, the elders begin speaking in names. Not just island names, but long names, names that stretch like sentences. Names that feel almost inconvenient if you're in a hurry. Luckily, no one here is. Each name is spoken carefully, with pauses in the right places, as if punctuation matters even when nothing is written down. You're told that island names were never just labels. They were containers. They held direction, distance, time, and experience all at once. That's your mainstream historical fact sliding in quietly. Many Polynesian place names encoded navigational information, historical events, or environmental cues, acting as mnemonic devices rather than simple identifiers. One elder recites a name that includes a reference to a prevailing wind, a star rising point, and an ancestor who first reached the island. You try to remember the name. You fail immediately. The elder smiles, because forgetting once is part of remembering later. Joke number 1. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some names were intentionally long and rhythmic so they would stick. Short names are easy to mix up. Long names demand attention. They slow you down. In a navigation system built on memory, slowness is a feature, not a flaw. As the canoe moves, the elders explain how routes were remembered as chains of names. Say the names in the right order, and you recall the journey. Skip one, and something feels wrong. Like missing a stair in the dark. That feeling, that tiny internal stumble, is a warning system. Memory alerts you before logic does. Historians still argue how standardized these naming conventions were across Polynesia. Some believe they varied greatly between islands and lineages. Others argue there were shared structural patterns even when the words differed. Listening to the elders, you get the sense that both can be true at once. Someone jokes that this is why outsiders struggled so much, because they wrote the names down but forgot to listen to them. Joke number 2. Gently smug, but earned. You notice how speaking the names changes the mood. The canoe feels anchored, not physically, but emotionally. Names make places feel closer. Even islands far beyond the horizon begin to feel present. Like acquaintances you haven't seen in a while but trust completely. An elder mentions that forgetting a name wasn't shameful. It was dangerous only if you pretended not to forget. Honesty kept memory accurate. Silence invited correction. Pride invited drifting. That lands quietly, heavier than it sounds. You repeat a name under your breath. It doesn't stick yet, but the rhythm does. That's enough for now. The canoe keeps moving, guided by names that remember more than you can, carrying distance inside sound. The canoe moves into a quieter stretch of water, and with that calm comes a shift in tone. The elders' voices soften further, not because they're tired, but because what they're speaking about now doesn't like to be rushed. Navigation. You learn, was never just a technical skill. It was a responsibility, a sacred one, even if no one uses that word out loud. You begin to sense how wayfinding was tied to ancestry. Routes weren't invented, they were inherited. Each journey echoed earlier journeys made by parents, grandparents, and names that now lived only in chants. That's your mainstream historical fact here. In many Polynesian cultures, navigation knowledge was closely linked to genealogy and spiritual duty, passed down within families or specialized lineages. An elder explains that knowing a route meant knowing who first sailed it, who survived it, and who didn't come back. Memory wasn't neutral, it carried obligation. You weren't navigating for yourself. You were navigating on behalf of those who trusted you with their knowledge. No pressure, just the weight of centuries. Joke number 1 lands quietly, because even sarcasm behaves respectfully here. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some navigators were believed to receive guidance from ancestors during voyages, not through visions or voices, but through sudden clarity, a feeling of, this is right, arriving without explanation. Modern psychology might call it intuition shaped by experience. Traditional language calls it listening beyond yourself. Historians still argue how literally spiritual guidance was interpreted versus metaphorical explanations layered over practical skill. Out here, that debate dissolves. Whether the guidance comes from ancestors or neurons, the result is the same. The canoe stays on course. You notice small rituals woven into the voyage. A pause before sunset, a quiet moment before naming a star. These aren't superstition, they're focus tools. Ritual slows the mind just enough to sharpen perception. You think about how modern routines, coffee before work, music before sleep, do the same thing. Joke number 2 sneaks in as you realize you already have rituals. You just pretend they're accidental. The elders speak of consequences, but gently. Navigating carelessly wasn't punished with anger, it was corrected with story. Tales of missed islands, extended voyages, unnecessary suffering. The lesson wasn't fear, it was respect. Respect for the ocean, for memory, for those who would sail after you. You feel that respect settle into your body, heavy but comforting. The canoe isn't just moving through space, it's moving through responsibility shared across time. That makes the night feel fuller, less empty. Someone jokes softly that the ocean remembers bad navigators longer than good ones. Joke number 3 drifts by, and no one argues. As the canoe glides on, you sense that navigation here isn't about control. It's about alignment, with stars, with swells, with stories, with those who came before. The knowledge doesn't belong to you. You're just holding it for a while. And somehow, that makes holding it easier. The canoe drifts onward, and the conversation shifts again. This time without ceremony. Names change, pronouns soften, stories widen. You begin to notice that many of the memories being shared don't belong to the men speaking them. They belong to mothers, grandmothers, aunts, voices remembered through voices. Navigation, you realize, was never as singular or gendered as outsiders later assumed. An elder speaks of a woman who never sailed far herself but could recite entire routes flawlessly. She knew the stars, the swells, the birds, the names, every detail, yet chose to remain on land. Teaching others instead. That's your mainstream historical fact for this section. Women in Polynesian societies often played crucial roles as knowledge keepers, educators, and oral historians in navigation traditions, even when they weren't the ones steering the canoe. You feel a quiet recalibration happen in your mind. The image of the lone male navigator dissolves into something more accurate, more communal. Knowledge didn't move only with paddles. It moved with stories told at night, corrections whispered during meals, and patient repetition over years. Here comes the quirky tidbit. In some traditions, women were believed to have especially strong memories for genealogies and place names, making them essential to preserving long-distance routes. While the canoe traveled, the archive stayed ashore, tended carefully like a garden. Lose the garden, and eventually the canoe forgets where to go. Historians still argue how visible women's roles were during actual voyages versus during training and memory preservation. Early European accounts often ignored or misunderstood these contributions, focusing narrowly on who held the steering paddle. Sitting here, listening, that narrowness feels almost quaint. Someone jokes, softly, that memory doesn't care who carries it, as long as it's carried well. Joke number 1 lands with a nod or two. You notice how stories about women aren't framed as exceptions. They're simply part of the landscape. A navigator's mother who corrected star names. A grandmother who remembered a route better than anyone alive. A sister who noticed cloud patterns others missed. No one announces these as remarkable. They're just accurate. The elders explain that memory survives best when shared across different kinds of minds. Some people remember rhythm, some remember images, some remember names. Diversity isn't decoration, it's redundancy. Lose one perspective, and others still hold. You think about how easily histories flatten complexity. How tidy stories replace tangled ones. Out here, tangles are preserved deliberately. They're safer. Joke number 2 drifts in when someone mentions that arguing with a grandmother about directions never ends well, whether on land or sea. As the canoe continues, you feel the night soften further. Knowledge expands, not contracts. The path forward feels wider now, supported by more voices than you first realized. Navigation isn't a lone figure against the stars. It's a chorus, remembered and renewed, carried by anyone willing to listen long enough. The canoe keeps its steady pace, but the stories take on a sharper edge now. Not tense, just clearer. Like air after rain, the elders' voices shift when outsiders enter the memory. You hear unfamiliar names, clipped syllables, accents that don't belong to the ocean. This is where the calm world you've been floating in brushes up against another one that arrived loudly and listened poorly. You're told about the first European ships that appeared on the horizon, massive, creaking things that seemed almost offended by the sea. Their navigators carried charts, instruments, and confidence, and they looked at Polynesian canoes with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. That's your mainstream historical fact for this section. Early European explorers often doubted or dismissed Polynesian navigation skills, assuming long-distance voyages were accidental or impossible without Western tools. The elders recount how questions were asked politely but answered impatiently. Where is your map? How do you know where you are? The answers, stories, stars, memory, didn't satisfy people trained to trust ink over experience. You imagine trying to explain muscle memory to someone who only believes in manuals. Joke number 1 slips in quietly. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some Europeans recorded Polynesian routes in their journals without realizing they were copying living memory into dead paper. Later readers assumed the knowledge originated with the writer, not the speaker. The ocean didn't correct the mistake, but history eventually did, slowly. Historians still argue how much of this dismissal was genuine misunderstanding versus deliberate minimization to justify colonial authority. Out here, the argument feels heavy but distant. The elders don't speak angrily. They speak patiently, like people who know memory outlasts arrogance. You sense the frustration beneath the calm. Navigation was called primitive because it wasn't written down, as if writing were the only proof that thinking happened. Someone jokes, dryly, that paper sinks faster than canoes. Joke number 2 earns a quiet smile. Despite the doubt, Europeans relied on Polynesian pilots more often than they admitted. When charts failed, memory succeeded. When instruments broke, stars didn't. This contradiction sits unspoken in many historical accounts. But not here. The elders remember who asked for help, even if the books forgot. The canoe glides on, unaffected by centuries-old opinions. The ocean never cared who believed in what. It responded only to skill, attention, and humility. You feel a subtle pride, not personal, but borrowed, like standing near something resilient. Memory didn't need validation, it worked anyway. The stories soften again, tension dissolving back into rhythm. Outsiders fade from the narrative, leaving stars, swells, and voices behind. The canoe continues forward, steady as ever, carrying knowledge that never needed permission to exist. The canoe feels slightly different now, not because the ocean has changed, But because the stories have moved closer to the present, the elders' voices take on a careful tone, like people stepping across a bridge between memory and recovery. You hear years mentioned with numbers that feel familiar, recent enough to almost touch. This is where forgetting nearly won, and then didn't. You're told that by the early 20th century, much of Polynesian wayfinding knowledge had faded or been pushed aside. Engines arrived. Compasses replaced chants. Schools favored books over elders. Routes that once lived vividly in memory grew quiet. That's your mainstream historical fact for this section. Traditional Polynesian navigation declined significantly during the colonial and early modern periods, as Western navigation tools became dominant. For a moment, the canoe seems to drift through that forgetting. The stars are still there, but fewer names are spoken. Silence stretches. You feel the weight of knowledge almost slipping away, not dramatically, just gradually, the way habits disappear when no one notices. Then the stories turn. You hear about people who chose to remember anyway. In the 1970s, a small group of navigators and scholars began asking elders questions again, not as curiosities, but as students. They listened slowly. They trusted memory. They built canoes by hand. This quiet revival is part of what brought traditional wayfinding back into living practice. Here comes the quirky tidbit. One master navigator famously demonstrated traditional navigation by sailing hundreds of miles without instruments. Just stars, swells, and memory, silencing skeptics without saying a word. The canoe arrived exactly where memory said it would. No speech required. Joke number 1 lands softly, because reality did the punchline. Historians still argue whether modern reconstructions of traditional navigation fully capture ancient practices or represent respectful adaptations shaped by contemporary contexts. Sitting here, that debate feels gentle rather than divisive. Memory doesn't need to be frozen in time to be real. It needs to be used. You sense renewed energy in the canoe. The elders speak with something like relief. Knowledge that was once treated as obsolete proved itself quietly. Patiently, not by arguing, but by working. Someone jokes that it turns out you don't forget the ocean, you just stop listening to it. Joke number 2 drifts by. Earned. The stars continue their slow rotation. The swells remain steady. You realize that rediscovery didn't invent anything new. It simply remembered how to remember. The canoe moves on, carrying both loss and recovery together. Balanced, calm. The canoe feels lighter now, not because anything has been removed, but because something heavy has been set down gently. The elder's voice is slow, stretching words the way you stretched before rest. This part of the journey isn't about proving anything anymore. It's about wondering, quietly, how much a human mind can really hold. You find yourself thinking about scale. Hundreds of islands, thousands of stars, countless swells, winds, birds, clouds, names, stories, and yet, memory carried it all, without ink or screens. That's the mainstream historical fact easing into focus here. Polynesian navigators demonstrated extraordinary long-term spatial memory, integrating environmental cues into coherent mental maps spanning vast ocean distances. An elder speaks about limits, not as failures, but as boundaries. Memory wasn't infinite. It required care. Routes faded if unused. Names softened if not spoken. That's why repetition mattered. That's why stories were told again and again, even when everyone already knew them. Especially then. Here comes the quirky tidbit. Some navigators reportedly practiced journeys entirely in their minds while resting on land, sailing through memory to keep routes alive. You imagine lying down for a nap and accidentally crossing an ocean. Joke number 1 arrives quietly and leaves just as politely. Historians still argue whether human memory alone could reliably preserve precise navigation across generations without gradual distortion. Some suggest small errors accumulated over time. Others argue that constant correction through experience kept memory remarkably accurate. Listening here, you sense that both views might be true, and that the system was designed with that in mind. You realize memory wasn't expected to be perfect. It was expected to be adaptive. When something felt wrong, navigators adjusted. When doubt crept in, They slowed down. Speed wasn't the goal, arrival was. Someone mentions that modern tools often weaken memory because they remove the need to notice. The elders don't criticize technology. They just observe the trade-off. Joke number 2 drifts in when someone says phones remember everything except how to listen. The canoe continues on, unhurried. You stop trying to measure how much you're learning. Instead, you let it soak in. The night grows softer, quieter. Stars blur slightly, not from clouds, but from relaxed eyes. Memory here doesn't feel like effort anymore. It feels like trust that what matters will surface when needed. And what doesn't can rest. The ocean breathes. The canoe holds. Your thoughts slow to match the rhythm. The canoe angles almost imperceptibly. And this time you don't question it. You don't search the stars for confirmation or tense your legs against the swell. You simply accept the motion. The way you accept the feeling of drifting toward sleep when your body finally decides it's safe to let go. The elders' voices are fewer now. Not because there's nothing left to say, but because the journey has entered a quieter phase. Someone speaks of home, not as a place behind or ahead, but as something you carry while moving. Islands, they remind you, were never just destinations. They were pauses in a longer rhythm of departure and return. That's the last mainstream historical fact easing into place. Polynesian voyaging cultures understood navigation as cyclical, with routes remembered not only to reach new lands, but to come back again. You feel that idea settle deeply. Memory isn't about escape, it's about continuity. Here comes the final quirky tidbit, offered almost like a bedtime secret. Some navigators said the best voyages ended when you stopped thinking about arrival entirely. When anticipation faded, land appeared. You smile at that, unsure whether it's wisdom or coincidence, and decide it doesn't matter. Joke number 1 drifts in and out like a wave that barely breaks. Historians still argue whether this calm confidence was learned through training alone or shaped by cultural worldview, whether believing the ocean was knowable made it more navigable. Standing here, you suspect belief and practice braided together so tightly they can't be untangled anymore. The canoe moves smoothly now, like it has found a groove it intends to keep. The stars continue their patient rotation. The swells remain steady, no longer demanding attention. You feel held, by wood, by water, by accumulated memory older than any single voice speaking tonight. The elders fall silent one by one, not abruptly, just naturally, as if conversation has reached its final, comfortable thought. You remain standing, but your body feels loose, supported. The horizon is invisible now, but it doesn't feel empty. You realize something gently surprising. Remembering islands without maps was never about mastering the ocean. It was about trusting memory enough to relax into it, about knowing that attention, shared and repeated, could carry you farther than fear ever would. The canoe glides on, and your thoughts slow to match it. Wind down, final 300 words. Now the night grows even softer, as if the world itself is lowering its voice. The canoe continues forward, but you no longer feel the need to track its movement. The stars blur into a gentle pattern, no longer individual points to name or follow. They become a quiet glow, like distant porch lights in a neighborhood you know well enough not to count anymore. Your breathing evens out. The ocean's rhythm becomes less something you notice and more something you join. Each rise and fall feels predictable, safe, almost reassuring. The elder's presence lingers, even in silence, like warmth after a fire has burned down to embers. You don't need to remember every detail from the journey. You don't need to hold onto star paths, swell patterns, or long island names. They've done their work already. What remains is the feeling, the calm confidence that comes from knowing memory doesn't disappear when you stop gripping it. It settles, it rests, it waits. The canoe keeps moving, but it could just as easily be still. Time stretches, distance softens, the ocean no longer feels vast. It feels familiar, like a sound you've fallen asleep to many times before. If thoughts drift in, let them drift back out again, like birds heading home at dusk. There's no need to follow them. There's nowhere you need to steer. The journey knows where it's going now. The water breathes. The stars turn slowly. The canoe carries you forward without effort. And somewhere, just beyond awareness, land waits patiently, not demanding arrival. Not rushing you, simply remembering that you're on your way. End of script. Sweet dreams.